And let's go ahead and dive into the meat of this. So we are going to be walking through the outcomes of a study commissioned by San Joaquin COG, supported by Caltrans, that looks at residential displacement here in San Joaquin County. Enterprise Community Partners, the organization I work with, and the University of California, Davis's Center for Community Change worked together to develop the findings we're sharing today and to create a mapping tool that will be publicly available for anyone to use who is interested in learning more about what's happening in San Joaquin County around displacement. So we'll just start off with some quick introductions. Again, my name is Christine Williams. I'm a program director for Enterprise Community Partners. We're a nationwide nonprofit organization that works on a range of affordable housing issues. I live here in Stockton, and I lead Enterprise's programmatic and policy initiatives across the San Joaquin Valley. And I'm joined today by my colleague and study partner, Bernadette Austin, who is the director for UC Davis's Center for Regional Change, dedicated to producing innovative and collaborative research to help improve communities across California. You've also heard from the San Joaquin Council of Governments. If you're not already familiar, they're a joint powers authority that works to convene local jurisdictions and other regional entities, and they oversee regional transportation funding across the region. And then tomorrow, we will be joined by our colleagues at Stockton's own University of the Pacific. So happy to be presenting with everybody today.
Hey, Christine, can we pause really quick? For the interpreters, there's a request to just kind of slow down your speech a little bit so that they can keep up with the flow of content. So just a reminder to our speakers. Thank you.
Can do. Thank you for that reminder. Okay, so you hopefully noted that this housing symposium is taking place over 2 days, today and tomorrow. Today's focus again is really looking at displacement drivers at the county level, reviewing a new mapping tool, and we will be following these two presentations with a panel discussion. So thank you to Faith in the Valley and San Joaquin Fair Housing for their participation today. And we'll be talking more about the work our community is doing to help promote housing stability. Tomorrow, we'll focus on the practical uses of a policy toolkit developed by my colleague, Brenda Amboy, and we'll be delving deeper into how local agencies, so cities and counties, can use the information presented today to help achieve progress on their overall housing goals. If you have questions, logistical or content-wise, as we are going through today's material, please feel free to put them in the chat. Just for our other moderators, I can't actively see the chat, so if you want me to pause at any time, just verbally let me know. And then also during today's panel discussion, we will have a link to a free interactive tool called Mentimeter, where you'll be able to participate directly in the conversation. And so we'll get to that in a bit, but with that, let's dive in. For the sake of time, I'm gonna skip this slide, basically reiterating the goals of the study to understand local drivers of displacement, create a mapping tool, and make some recommendations to SJCOG as to their role in preventing displacement. And first, I think it's important that we get to a place where we have a shared understanding when it comes to defining displacement. So for the purposes of this study, we're using a definition put forth by UC Berkeley's Urban Displacement Project. And they specifically note that displacement occurs when any household is forced to move from its residence by conditions outside of its control. And you can see this chart sort of organizes the types and causes of displacement even further. I think displacement is really kind of a misunderstood crisis, right? So there are a few key things that are often left out of the narrative that are worth mentioning. One is that displacement happens in many different ways, and we can't effectively prevent it until we recognize and acknowledge all of its forms. So displacement is not just evictions, but it's any sort of pressure that is forcing people to move, again, as this chart demonstrates. So things like foreclosure, habitability issues, things we term soft evictions. So landlord neglect, landlord harassment, having your utilities shut off. These are all things that can make it impossible for families to stay securely housed. And displacement is also not just a one-time event, right? It can have lasting impacts for families and their opportunities. And we know that low-income people and people of color are often the hardest hit. We also know there's a lot of research showing that displacement has negative impacts on community and resident health. So evictions have been linked to an increased likelihood of subsequent homelessness and housing insecurity, as well as having negative impacts on individual mental health and leading directly to increased emergency room visits per one study. So hopefully this makes it clear that avoiding displacement and promoting household and neighborhood stability is something that really benefits our community as a whole and something we should all be collectively pursuing. So San Joaquin COG, again, as an entity that oversees regional transportation investments, wanted to better understand the relationship between those types of investments and their impact on displacement. So we know the data shows that in transit investment, and particularly rail investment, can have negative impacts on neighborhoods that are near adjacent to rail stations. And so in San Joaquin County, this is something we should look into because there's currently over $1 billion in planned investments going specifically to rail expansion in the county. And I'll show a map on the next slide, but both the ACE and the San Joaquin's rail service, if you're familiar with those lines, are looking to increase their frequency and proposing potential new stop locations. So places like Lathrop and Ripon currently have proposed station sites to help facilitate that expansion. And we know that expanding public transit options can bring a host of benefits, right? So we can help get people out of cars into a more efficient form of transportation. But we also know that where we locate transit and how we invest our public dollars can have negative consequences if it's not done responsibly. So some of you may be aware of the federal government's urban renewal program from last century. Makes you feel old, but you know, it had sometimes really devastating impacts on particularly low-income neighborhoods and neighborhoods made up of people of color. So if you're familiar with Stockton and you've ever driven on the Crosstown Freeway, that infrastructure project was funded through the federal urban renewal program, but it also ran through a neighborhood called Little Manila. So what was once a very vibrant Filipino neighborhood, and the freeway effectively destroyed and disconnected that community. So we know that transit-rich neighborhoods tend to disproportionately be made up of lower income households, households of color, and renters. These are all vulnerable populations. So how can we make sure that new investment doesn't perpetuate structural racism or continue these historical harms? And something we found in the literature showed that if you have affordable housing provisions and other displacement mitigation policies, what we call affordability first policies in place prior to any real project planning. So if you're protecting these neighborhoods in place before bringing the investment in, that can really help prevent the loss of existing communities. And it's something we should all be thinking about as we consider this increase in investment coming to our region. So here you can see, this is just the service expansion map that shows purple dots are existing rail stop locations and the yellow dots are all proposed. So much better interconnectivity linking San Joaquin County to both Sacramento, the Bay Area, and all the way down to Merced to the high-speed rail station that's planned there. So a lot of, I think, good expansion, but we need to be mindful about the impacts. Okay, so I might breeze through this as well. We talked about the harm that displacement can have on individuals and households, but this slide was really meant to drive the point home that this displacement again has a ripple effect that hurts all of us as a community. So, you know, it increases the risk of households falling into homelessness, poor health and educational outcomes for children. And, you know, in the case of Little Manila, can eliminate entire neighborhoods. So it's really important that our public planning processes think about displacement on the front end rather than as a potential consequence we're evaluating on the back end. Okay, so hopefully we've established that displacement is harmful, and now I really want to go into some data that can better help characterize the risk of households within San Joaquin County. So this first slide, there are two initial takeaways. One, San Joaquin County is growing. In fact, between 2000 and 2018, the population increased almost 30%. That is a faster growth rate than we see in neighboring counties, a faster growth rate than the statewide average. Oops. And even with this growth, San Joaquin County residents still tend to be made up of lower income households. So just over 40% of San Joaquin County households report making less than $50,000 annually. When we look at the broader county, the broader economy within San Joaquin County, it's also struggling. And I think the pandemic really exposed some of the vulnerabilities of our regional economy. So San Joaquin County has high concentrations of jobs in retail, transportation, and warehousing sectors. And all of these were initially really hard hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. I think we've seen a little bit of rebound in warehousing, but generally pretty vulnerable employment sectors. Our unemployment rates also really skyrocketed during the pandemic. So generally, San Joaquin County's unemployment rate hovers between 6 and 9%. It went up to almost 18% in April 2020, sort of at the height of the economic impacts of the pandemic. And it has thankfully come back down to that 6 to 9% range based on data towards the end of last year. And then what this graph is showing is that, in particular, the city of Stockton saw some of the highest rates of business closures at the height of the pandemic. So Yelp actually pulled together some internal data and put out this chart. And you can see that Stockton on the left side is really hitting kind of mid-range there. Well, leading there actually in terms of permanent business closures. And we can see that also in our commercial vacancy rates at the county level, right? Those are as high as 12 to 13%, much higher than we see in neighboring counties. And then we've also seen an increase in out commuters. So people who live in San Joaquin County, but commute outside of the county for employment. So in 2000, over half of San Joaquin County residents worked within the county, and today that number is at 48%. So over half of those who are employed within the county are traveling outside for work. And then, of course, despite all of these challenges, the local housing market has continued to go up. And so for renters, this is Zillow's rent index data. There has really been a consistent uptick in rental prices since 2014. And this chart shows notably that the Stockton metro area is really outpacing its neighbors, right? And not just in comparable markets, but also compared to high cost coastal markets like San Francisco in terms of our percent increase in average rents. And these increases haven't shown any signs of slowing down, even amidst the pandemic. And that is also unlike what's been observed in other high cost regions that have seen a small dip in rental costs. And the same holds for home values on the for sale market. So San Joaquin County has seen some of the greatest volatility in the state. You can see we saw one of the most extreme dips in home values between kind of the housing peak in 2006 and the bottom of the market in 2012. And then the rebound has sort of been just as drastic. So I think housing prices have increased a somewhat astonishing 144%. Again, that's higher than the statewide average, higher than neighboring counties. And home values now sit just beyond what we saw at the height of the bubble before the recession hit. So what does all of that create? It creates housing insecurity. So over half of San Joaquin County renters are paying more than 30% of their income on housing costs. 30% is the threshold we use in determining whether housing is affordable or not. And this is in contrast to homeowners, but even then, slightly over a third of all homeowners are also paying over 30% of their income toward housing costs. So besides the stress and the impact of struggling to keep your home, shelter over your head, housing insecurity also leads to increased risk of homelessness. And San Joaquin County saw a really striking 70% increase in its unsheltered population between 2017 and 2019. And of those residents living without shelter, we also find that Black residents are significantly overrepresented. So despite making up a little over 7% of the county's total population, Black Black residents make up over a quarter of the county's unsheltered population. So we kind of collected all this data, and then we went and talked to a variety of both public agencies, service organizations, and community-based groups that deal with housing issues. And every organization we interviewed indicated that displacement was a growing concern, particularly as housing insecurity soared with the onset of the pandemic. One thing to note that came up is some interviewees called out the explosive growth of the warehousing industry and its impact it was having on local roads. So we heard the story of one woman who had moved to Manteca from West Oakland. And when she lived in West Oakland, she was subject to air pollution from living close to a major trucking route. And she was now dismayed because she was considering the need to once again relocate because a warehouse had opened nearby and truck traffic had been diverted onto a road that ran in front of her house and was again impacting the habitability of her home. We also found that interviewees unanimously noted that San Joaquin County lacks diverse housing options available at a range of different incomes. In Escalon, this lack of smaller housing units is putting strain on the local senior population. So when they're looking to downsize, they just can't find units available at an affordable level. And this lack of housing diversity also squeezes what we refer to as the missing middle. So these are households with incomes high enough that they don't qualify for subsidized housing, but are still feeling the financial struggles tied to increasing housing costs. And then again, concerns I'm sure many of you have heard around an eviction swell, right? So as eviction protections tied to COVID come to an end, many organizations working with impacted residents are fearful of increases in eviction notices being served. And this is even despite federal, state, and local assistance that's available to help keep people securely housed. We heard that a lot of organizations trying to administer those funds are still struggling to scale up the communication needed to make sure landlords and residents are aware of these local and statewide rules and regulations. Administering organizations also noted a reluctance among landlords to enroll in programs that can help keep their tenants housed and make up COVID-related losses. So it's further exacerbating kind of those concerns. And then public agency staff also shared some common concerns around being able to fund the infrastructure needed to keep up with additional housing growth, especially in infill locations like downtown neighborhoods. And so with that, hopefully we're kind of taking away a shared understanding of where San Joaquin County stands as a whole as it relates to perceptions of displacement risk. And I'm going to kick it over to Bernadette to walk us through the development of a tool that we can all use to help better understand exactly what's happening on the ground. So Bernadette, let me know when you'd like me to advance slides and I can move us through.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
I can, yes.
Great, excellent. So next slide. I will work on talking very slowly, so you can let me know in the chat if I'm going too quickly. So I'm Bernadette Austin, Executive Director with the Center for Regional Change at UC Davis, and I'm going to talk to you about how we developed this mapping tool, and we will be sharing links in the chat, and links will be made available with the PowerPoints as well. So how did we develop the mapping tool? There were 4 main steps. First, we reviewed existing models, and then we gathered additional data, adapted typology for the San Joaquin Valley context. After that, we gathered additional data sets, and finally, we created an interactive web app. Next slide. So let's talk about the models that we reviewed. The main model we reviewed, it was the Urban Displacement Project generated by UC Berkeley, and several others. I won't get into them due to time, but what we came up with was a gentrification and displacement assessment specifically for San Joaquin County. And on your right, you'll see some colors. We'll be going over those in a little bit, but you can kind of see, let me zoom in a little bit. Pardon me. So you can see the light blue are the areas that are susceptible to ongoing displacement. The more brown areas are at varying levels of exclusiveness. So they are already out of the price range for many folks. The gray areas are sort of these unique areas in which there isn't necessarily data easily available. So next slide. Oh, pardon me, hold on, I closed my presentation. All right, so the next step we did was adapting the topology for the San Joaquin Valley context. And what do we mean by typology? It's those same colors that we were talking about just a moment ago. So again, highlighting them into greater detail, the areas that are the orange and the third and fourth one down, the orange and red, are increasingly expensive and out of the cost range of folks who are earning the average median wages for the area. The blue and purple areas are places that are at risk. So folks who are earning median wages, lower income wages, may be living here, but these areas may be at risk for displacement. And again, those gray areas tend to be places where, for example, there are high prison or student populations where there's just different data available. We can go to the next slide. So we talked about looking at indicators that are special to this particular context for this area. And so we went to several different sources. For example, one of the data sources that we added were affordable homes that are at risk for converting to market rate. So apartment complexes that are deed restricted, that already have affordable rents, may be at risk for converting to market rent. We have our colleagues at CHPC to thank for that. Our colleagues at Faith in the Valley provided data for rental eviction rate. We will see one of those data sets in a little bit. We had, in partnership with the California Coalition for Rural Housing, data on high amenity parcels. So locations that are near amenities such as grocery stores, schools, and transit stops. There were several other additional data sets. A notable one is the percentage of people of color. We'll see an example of that in a little bit. Median household income. So again, that's sort of the average level, the middle level of income, and that's not for individuals, that's for an entire household. The real median home value and rent values. So looking at home values and rent values, we got that data from Zillow, and ACS is census data, and then college education population. Future editions, what we hope to be able to include in future editions may include CalEnviroScreen 4.0, that's looking at some environmental data, environmental health and environmental justice data, historic redlining districts, transit data, and other administrative boundaries. So you'll be seeing in a moment boundaries around census tracts. So next slide. So the next step we did was create an interactive web app. So this is a web-based tool. Again, we'll be sharing the link in chat. So you can actually go there now. You can see that there are multiple viewing screens. In this case, we're looking at 2. So you can look at the same location with 2 different data sets. We also tried to have a color-friendly scheme so that it's avoiding good and bad associations, such as redlining, green, etc., and also that it can help with folks who may have color blindness. So that's one of the reasons that we've selected some of the color schemes that you see today. Next slide. So what does the mapping tool tell us? These 3 bullets are certainly not an exhaustive list. They're really just highlights, but I'll mention a couple of things. One is indicators matter. They differ by regions. So we know that, for example, we've done a lot to adapt a model that was developed for the Bay Area for a Central Valley context, because we have different indicators, different data that we are looking at that matter, and also the weighting of the data, how important it is. We also know that settings are different. Urban, suburban, rural, and others really factor in to this information that we've determined for displacement and gentrification. Now, we're going in a moment to pull up a couple of maps for you to see what this might look like in action. And you can see that by, for example, looking at 2 side-by-side data sets, you can tell a lot from that particular data set, as well as how they compare to one another. So for example, we're going to look at the connection between displacement risk and race, and we will also be looking at the relationship between displacement risk and rent-related evictions. So next slide, please. So on the right is the mapping tool. So looking at displacement risk. Again, the higher risk areas, the areas that are at high risk are the blue and purple, and the areas that are already starting to become exclusive, and another way of saying that is unaffordable, are in the sort of colors. On the left side, we look at percentage of people of color. And again, if you note that mid-level is not 0, it's not 50%. It's basically right-sized. So we already know that we have very diverse communities. So the deeper colors show much deeper levels of diversity. All right, we can go to the next slide. So when you go to the interactive map, you can actually click on these areas. You can use landmarks such as roadways to click on the areas that you're looking for, in this case, a census tract, and you can dive deeper into what that data is telling you. The colors are supposed to give you a general sense, but you can also get really accurate data for the particular areas that you are interested in. So next slide. So the last slide, we were looking at 2 different data sets. We were looking at the displacement on the right and people of color on the left. Those are the green colors. In this map, we have one side that's showing the displacement risk. Again, that's what this map is measuring. And we've overlaid it. We've added one additional data set. In this case, this is the data set on rental eviction rates. So bearing in mind that while this mapping tool can be really overwhelming because there's so much information, having things in a visual representation can be a great way to collect lots and lots of information and tell a powerful story. It's an easier way to digest it. It's an easier way to share this information with decision makers and policy makers for the particular goals that you may have. I think that the most powerful way that groups can use this tool, and we'll be talking about this with you later, is to think about how do you bring together this data, this data visualization, together with the actual experiences of people and the actual observations of the professionals who are working in this space. So if you want to go to the next slide. So I'll just offer up 2 ideas how stakeholders could use this mapping tool. As you've been told, we did quite a bit of outreach to various particular community partners and stakeholders. One way that local governments can use this tool is to really inform and support a lot of the efforts that they are working on at the moment. So for example, currently or in the near future, they will be updating their housing element. For those of you who aren't familiar with the housing element, it's essentially one chapter of the entire general plan of what guides a local jurisdiction. So how do they plan for housing and how do they intend to grow housing? This can really help inform those efforts. Another example is the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing initiative. So some of you may be familiar with fair housing that came about as a policy during the civil rights movement. However, there's an effort to really advance that, affirmatively further these fair housing efforts. There are many types of efforts and plans underway, but those are 2 pretty key examples. Housing organizations. This may be groups that do housing advocacy, affordable housing development, and others. They can use this information for guiding their housing development. I mentioned earlier that one of the data sets we used was one that we developed with a coalition, the California Coalition for Rural Housing. And so we've looked at parcels that have high amenities. These parcels are more competitive for state funding for tax credit tax credit allocations, which is one of the key ways that affordable housing is funded. It also may be key in looking at renter protection strategies. So, for example, are you looking at high populations of communities of color? Are areas with higher rental eviction appear to be at some of these higher displacement risk? This can help you really target your advocacy and outreach efforts. So I'm happy to join the panel after this and answer any questions that you all may have. Next slide and we'll move on.
Great, thanks, Bernadette. Okay, so we gathered all this data, we developed this tool, and then the next step was really making some recommendations to the San Joaquin COG on how to use this information, again, to ensure that its future investments and policies are helping to mitigate displacement risk. So we put forth 4 recommendations for SJCOG to consider, and they're here on the slide. The first is pretty general. It's really having COG as a facilitator to sort of host ongoing discussion about regional housing and neighborhood needs. So something we heard during our numerous interviews is that there isn't currently a organized countywide forum for sharing out best practices and talking again in a more coordinated fashion about how to address housing security in San Joaquin County. So we think SJCOG can really play a role in helping to host that conversation. The second recommendation is having San Joaquin COG develop its own set of internal protocols that can help guide how it allocates the regional transportation dollars it oversees. So this is something that other similar organizations have done. We held interviews with 3 other what are called metropolitan planning organizations that play similar roles as San Joaquin COG, both across California and in other states. And so having these sort of guidelines in place can help ensure that San Joaquin COG is not inadvertently funding projects that increase displacement risk. Third, there's a kind of a movement within the state to equip MPOs like San Joaquin COG with additional funding opportunities that help to advance affordable housing goals. So our report goes into much more detail about programs that San Joaquin COG could pursue to help direct this funding in ways to support both housing and infrastructure needs. And we'll be doing a deeper dive into some of those state level programs tomorrow. And then our final recommendation was seeing if San Joaquin COG can help incentivize its local member jurisdictions to meet their housing goals by potentially prioritizing discretionary funding for those local agencies that are actively working to meet regional housing need. So these are 4 recommendations that have been put forth. San Joaquin COG will sort of review and determine their path forward. But we're looking forward to having those conversations sort of collectively with them and throughout the community. So this concludes our presentation portion of today's agenda. And I just want to say thank you for bearing with us and having a lot of information thrown out there. We're now going to move over into our panel discussion. And so I'm going to ask that Robert from Fair Housing and Tony at Faith in the Valley, if you could go ahead and come on video. We're going to go over some instructions on the next slide to show all of you how you can participate in this next portion. Okay, so we're using a tool called Mentimeter, and if you would like to interact in the conversation, you're going to go ahead and go to www.menti.com. If a moderator could put that link in the chat, that would be great. And you will enter this code that is on the screen here, 94090037. And that's going to take you to a web page that has some questions on it, and you can respond in real time to those questions, and we can use those to kind of help facilitate the conversation. You can also go ahead if you have a mobile phone and scan this QR code, and that will also take you to Mentimeter, where again, you can put this code in. If folks can, great, we got the link to Menti and the code in the chat. With that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing the PowerPoint, and we're going to go ahead and share a different screen. So bear with me for a moment. Great, I see Robert and Tony on. Okay. All right, so can maybe Bernadette, I can see you. Are you able to see my screen here? Great, so the way you'll use this tool if you've logged on is you can navigate here at the bottom, and it will take you through some different prompts. We're gonna be asking the panelists these same questions, and as thoughts come up on your end, please feel free to type them in, and again, we can kind of use them to guide our discussion today. So maybe we can start with some introductions for Robert and Tony, who haven't jumped on yet. And Robert, I'll go ahead and kick it over to you if you just want to let folks in the meeting know who you are, who you're with, and the kind of work you do.
Okay, I'm Robert Munoz. I'm the Executive Director of San Joaquin Fair Housing. Basically, we're right in the middle of this. We're working with families, making sure that they know what their rights and responsibilities are. And we do a lot of outreach so that the community knows that there is an agency that can answer some of these questions.
Great, thanks. And Tony, do you mind doing the same, a little intro?
Sure. My name is Tony McNeil. I am a lead community organizer with Faith in the Valley, primarily organized in the San Joaquin County. However, our organization is centered throughout the entire Central Valley. We do now have a housing organizer. However, over the past 6 years, 5 in particular, I've been focusing on restorative justice in housing and security specifically.
Great. Appreciate both of you for joining. So our first question up today is just whether there was any information in particular shared that stood out to you, or if there's information you have that wasn't shared, if you'd like to go ahead and take this opportunity to get that out there. And you can see we've got some folks tuning in, particularly with the statistic that Stockton rents have increased at higher rates than places we might think otherwise, right? So I'll open that up to our panelists if there's anything in particular.
Robert, I'm going to go first on this one because I think you might have more to say. But I just, with the first one you showed, that's the one that it's not a startling statistic. However, I am appreciative of the actual data, that is being brought forth to confirm that it feels like it as a native of Stockton, that Stockton's rent is rising, much faster, and then other Central Valley cities, throughout the county, you start to see then the increase that takes place from there. But I feel like the San Joaquin County, that we're at the precipice, of the increases and the disparities. And I would also be interested in, I think that our unhoused population are the number in the San Joaquin County, Stockton specific, but the San Joaquin County, I think that it's probably much greater than throughout the rest of the Central Valley.
And that's a true statement. Correct, not to correct me, but the rents we are seeing are being raised dramatically, especially in single family homes. I mean, there is no rent control when it comes to single family homes. And with the influx of people moving in from the Bay Area, owners, all they have to do is give their current tenants a rent increase. And again, it could be very dramatic, and the family generally has no choice if they can't afford it but to move out. So then these landlords can actually raise the rents to whatever they want. And that's what basically we're seeing, at least in multifamily. There is rent control, and the rents are still high though, especially in some of the places that, aren't being very well taken care of. But there is rent control. And again, if you wanted them to move, you have to have just cause when it comes to multifamily. Whereas in single family, there is no just cause anymore. And all the landlords do are raising rents. And we've seen rents go from like $1,600 to $2,500. And again, the family has to decide, can they afford that? And no, they can't. And we put together a rental list, and we're seeing a lot of single family homes, and the rents are just getting higher and higher. And I mean, we live in a community where we don't have high-tech jobs. So these families are working on minimum wage. And even with both families working and with public assistance, they're still unable to afford these rents. And what we're seeing is more and more families becoming homeless. And that's just not a good thing for our area.
Yeah, I'm hearing both those points echoed in the comments here. And I'm wondering, actually, Bernadette, this might be a good question to bump over to you. A question here about whether there's data showing migration into the county and what trends you might be seeing. So I'll let you kind of speak to that. Oh, can't hear you. Maybe you're double muted.
Sorry, I'm double muted. We are at the Center for Regional Change engaged in a research project looking at migration from the Bay Area to the Central Valley and Sierra foothills. That research should be done this year, but I'll tell you right now, we're seeing a couple things. One is that we saw that, and this should anecdotally come as no surprise to you, that migration accelerated significantly. And whereas before we saw more people moving from the Bay Area to the Central Valley due to high cost of living, we see a lot more people who are moving by choice. The implications of that might include that people who are doing housing developments are building for that higher income population. It also means that these folks have more equity and higher incomes, and that really can significantly increase displacement risk. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to predict looking forward, particularly because things are so uncertain, but the pandemic absolutely accelerated things, and we do not see that really slowing down in the near future.
Great. Yeah, a lot of additional questions kind of coming in. So looking forward to that research coming through.
Christine, can I add something to what Bernadette said? And this is just now from, so any lens that I bring, just for the sake of those that are watching, is from a grassroots, boots on the ground organizing perspective. In 2020, because I just been in my location for 2 years, and in 2020, for 6 months, I met all the criteria to move, right, Robert? All 3 times the amount of income, the credit background, the history, all of that. However, inventory was so sparse that they would put out a property that I would qualify for. I would apply for it, but it would be gone within 2 hours of that I and that went on for 6 months. Just the inventory issue alone. So I know that. I was contending with individuals that were migrating from the Bay Area, that were snatching up properties faster than the properties could even be, they could hit with Zillow or in any of the other applications for rent.
And that's true with single family homes. When a single family home becomes available, it's like an open house. You go and there's multiple families looking at the place, and the owners are going to go through them, and they're going to handpick who they want in there. It should be first come, first serve, but again, there's no way tracking that because these are mom and pop buying up homes and renting them out. And like I said, you can get whatever rent you want right now. I mean, I recall a home in that a family was trying to get into in Weston Ranch. It was a 3-bedroom, 2.5 bath, and I think it was 1,600. And then it went off the market. And then later on, it was like 2 months later, it was on there for 2,400. So, I mean, it's just a tough situation. We don't have enough multifamily homes. Single family homes are now, an option for people that have money. I mean, to rent. I mean, it's not like, we just don't have enough stock in this community is what it really comes down to.
Yeah, and that's something we heard over and over. I'm going to move us along to our next question, but appreciate everybody's comments on here. A lot of good engagement. So I think you've talked a bit about this, right? Like not having enough diverse supply, a range of affordability options. What other housing challenges are you seeing among those you serve? And for attendees, if you have your own thoughts or your own housing challenges you'd like to echo, happy to capture that as well.
Yeah.
One thing that's really going on in the multifamily area is, a lot of these families are paying high rents for dilapidated properties and, trying to get the landlords to do these repairs and then getting code enforcement involved. And then because of the pandemic and people not having the money that they did, that they had before, they're getting extensions of time to get these repairs done. And at some point, some of these families are just giving up. And once again, they're living in an apartment that they truly are struggling to pay the rent on, and yet it's a dilapidated property. And I'm not saying all landlords are like that, but I'm just saying there's just things that are going on in this community, and we need more assistance.
Yeah, Tony, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, and I was just trying to just make a list just to stay focused. So code enforcement, yes, is a huge issue. Not only is code enforcement a huge issue for those that are on the low income scale, but I also want to lift up code enforcement is a huge issue for our senior citizen population that do not have other means. They're on fixed incomes. Which then leads to senior citizen fixed income. You have senior citizens that are on fixed income with SSI, disability, or what have you, that absolutely cannot afford the increases in rent. So I have seen seniors that are sleeping on couches, that are living with grandchildren, that have lost their homes, that the wait list for affordable housing units. My father was one. He was waitlisted for quite a while to get into a low income for senior citizens is just unreasonable. It is insane. Now, keeping that in mind, the other thing to consider is that now you've got more seniors coming from the Bay Area into the affordable housing units and facilities and which means that and I'm going to say this for lack of a better way to say it, taking up space or displacing our seniors that are local. They have no place to go because now they're being waitlisted while others from the Bay Area are actually coming in and taking those spaces. Hotels. I have seen individuals that are being displaced that need to get into a hotel, and I'm literally, I have stories of domestic violence situations where mothers with children are desperately seeking just housing. It's a short of a bed capacity in the shelters. They can't get into the other spaces, and the hotels are full to the max, especially over the weekends. They are at capacity. We have not been able to find hotel accommodations for individuals going through displacement from domestic violence and situations on weekends for several months. And I'm talking Tracy, Manteca, Lathrop, French Camp. I mean, we've gone all the way to Galt, and haven't been able to get folks in a hotel over the weekend to get them through. So, and the hotel, people are living in hotels now because they don't meet 3 times the amount of rent. They don't meet the criteria in order to actually get placed into housing. So, I mean, I can go on and on and on about what it is that we are seeing taking place right now. When it comes to those that have a record, they cannot be transitioned into affordable housing, low income, because federal regulations have certain criteria. And if you are formerly incarcerated, you don't meet that criteria, which then drives that population or that family back into the unhoused community. I'm going to put a pin in it right there.
No, I think that's helpful, and it mirrors a lot of the feedback we're getting in the, just going to call it the chat for lack of a more technical term we all have to learn. But, you know, again, a lot of folks on fixed incomes, particularly seniors. So as you just mentioned, where the housing is located. So is it proximate to needed services, to a grocery store that sells healthy food? I'm also seeing, you know, struggles if you're one individual trying to find a small unit, right? And even for some of the affordable options, they're what we call family units. They're larger more bedrooms. You know, the selling of single family rental homes, so that tenants need to you know, have term limited time to find a new housing unit. Bernadette, I'm curious if there's anything else you think from UC Davis's perspective might be worth adding to this question here. You know, it's a slightly different kind of lens, right? But
well, could you repeat the initial question?
yeah, just housing challenges, you know, overall. So
just generally. So I really want to underscore, which you actually brought up in your presentation, is the mismatch between housing types and what people are looking for. So, and I think that's what folks are saying is, if we're creating a lot of larger single family homes, they are generally by definition less affordable than smaller units or apartments. There's also the reverse mismatch of maybe these are right sized for households with children, but some of these, you know, what we're seeing is that people are actually doubling up with multiple households. That might be relatives living together, maybe 2 adult sisters with their children are living together, or a family with their elder is living, so multiple households under one roof. We also have unrelated individuals living together, so lots of roommates. So that's what ends up happening is you end up having more dense, but not necessarily in a good way, more dense living situations, because that's what's available, rather than households being able to live on their own. For example, like a senior being able to live on their own rather than living with a household or roommate that maybe that's not their preference. That's frankly putting it nicely. Tony could probably share some stories around that, I'm sure. So a mismatch between what we're building, what is available, and also what people are looking for the types of housing that they're looking for. The other challenge around housing that I will underscore is, even when people are moving from the Bay Area, and let's say that they're making average or slightly higher incomes, they have a lot more equity. So if you are selling your home and you're coming here, that's creating a huge challenge. That's not just San Joaquin. We're seeing that across the state, where people have a lot of equity. They are much more competitive, and they're snatching up, they're able to be more competitive in the for sale housing market. So we're placing pressures both for renters as well as around home ownership.
Mm-hmm. And Christine, there's something that I don't see on here, and I want to make sure that we have it, because it's a population that is very much overlooked often. Valley Mountain Regional Center serves a significant amount of of individuals with disabilities that had the ability to actually live independently once upon a time. And now that opportunity is almost being snatched away from this community. They are on severely fixed incomes and literally having the most difficult time finding residency, place to live that is affordable for this community.
yeah, it's I mean, saying it's hard out there, I think, understates the crisis that people are facing every day. So appreciate this perspective. I also want to know, I think we're going to drop this link in the chat, but if folks are interested, it looks like there could be some resources available for single, well, not just for single family, for low income homeowners to address code enforcement needs. So just want to make sure folks are aware of that. I'm going to bump us along. Our next question here is if you could speak to the broader impact that displacement has in our community. I know I showed a lot of data, but you're on the ground fielding these calls every day. So we're just kind of appreciate you sharing your broader understanding of what this means for San Joaquin County.
Robert, you want me to take this one first or you? Which one?
Either way, Tony.
So impact. Once displaced, yeah. Once you lose, oh my God, this is a very emotional one. Once you lose your housing, it is a downward spiral from there. Trying to get back on your feet again in this county is short of a miracle. Children, the education of our children. You have more children, and I wish I had those stats right in front of me. Right now, we have a significantly large population of children that are unhoused right now. And once that child loses the stability of a home, then they become subject to being placed in the system and taken from their actual parents because of stabilities. And so you've got health disparities, you've got mental health disparities. Once you become unhoused, the stress, the emotional trauma that you undergo trying to figure it out just to stay above water. You have individuals that have had to do some very, very uncomfortable things just to sleep on the floors of apartments. You've got people that are living in places with bed bugs and roach infestations and no water, no running water, no hot water, bad plumbing, simply because that it's better than sleeping in the car in the parking lot. There are so many things right now that are taking place. When it comes to our displaced community, the last thing I want to say, our displaced community are the most judged and looked down upon. It's almost like they are just the blight of this community. People don't see them as working class. They don't see them. And because the rent is so high, the working class income is now the poverty level income in this city, which means that you used to think that you were doing okay economically, but rent went so high to where now you are at rock bottom low and you have no way to combat. So you now only qualify for affordable housing, low income housing, where at one point you're a hardworking family that only qualifies for now low income subsidized housing. We're really doing a disservice to the people in our community.
It's a true statement. You know, again, families, seniors, I mean, I have families renting rooms in homes, you know, I mean, and then you see so many homes now where they're renting rooms and it's a mix of people. You might have a family in one room. You might have a drug addict in another room. You might have someone with mental disabilities in another, and these people are not getting along. Landlords aren't monitoring it. They're just collecting rents. And again, repair issues, infestations, and people will put up with it because the next step is being homeless. And once you're homeless, I mean, again, like Tony said, it's going to be hard to start all over again, you know. And then if you do find a place and you've been homeless for 5-6 months or even longer, and then the landlord wants a landlord reference or where have you been living, I mean, that's going to count against you. I mean, the disparity in this county, I mean, it just scares me. I just wish that there was more money to do more housing and more monitoring of what landlords are doing. I mean, you can only talk to a landlord so many times. You can get code enforcement out there. But once again, you know, all this takes time. And at some point, families just get discouraged and they just move out. And then there you go. We'll never, again, what do we do?
Christine, I just wanted to chime in from a data perspective. One thing is we have data about rentals. Okay, so rental homes, rent apartments. We can look at point in time counts of homelessness. It's this middle piece that we do. There really is no good data out there. So I've heard this from colleagues like, can someone collect this? It is not an easy data set. So are we looking at social workers, teachers, et cetera? Those who are on the front lines are reporting that the people right on the edge, the folks who, again, multiple households under one roof, usually unrelated, like there isn't a good way to get data. So it's not like, oh, we'll go do a research project. There isn't a good way to get data, but I need people to hear that I have like some pretty major concerns that we have data on displacement risk. We have data on homelessness. We don't have data on this very high risk population, and it's going to be manifested in the point in time count. Right now, we don't see them as homeless because we don't see them. But when they are now on the streets, you can't get back from there, to Tony's point. So we're talking about pretty substantial issues. And what I wanted to raise with this is, you know, we were seeing some comments in the chat about this. Again, anecdotally, the kind of things that we see are increases in domestic violence and just general violence, theft, people being put at higher risk for assault, for sexual abuse. So there are some pretty serious issues when you have multiple households under one roof. So when we talk about overcrowding, that sounds like a very sanitized issue. The overcrowding issue can have some pretty serious social and criminal implications.
And I love that, Bernadette. Christine, I wanted to lift up as well that one thing that I realize is that there's a threshold for resources that most of the families that are in this middle bracket that Bernadette and I are lifting up, and Robert, they don't even qualify for these resources. They don't qualify for these services. You need to be at the bottom spectrum. Don't make 40 to 50,000 annually, which, by the way, is not enough to be able to actually afford to pay rent here or to purchase. So don't make that income and need assistance. You don't qualify. You qualify for nothing when it comes to supported services or what have you. I've had families that lost their job and were on unemployment during the pandemic that had more access to resources when it came to food stamps, when it came to unemployment, when they were receiving more than they were receiving when they were working. And when they went back to work, they didn't qualify for any of those resources and did not make as much income coming in as they were getting in a supplemental way.
Yeah, I appreciate that. All of this that you're sharing, again, like very much echoed in what our attendees are sharing, especially that kind of like hidden risk, right? People are just one incident away from falling behind on being able to afford their housing or being evicted or not being able to pay rent or their mortgage, right? And so that safety net does not exist. We might move here to this final question for you all, so I can give San Joaquin COG a bit of time at the end here to talk a little bit about next steps. But just curious what you would like to see from your public agencies, right? Be that San Joaquin COG, be that cities, counties, what type of next steps do you think are critical in ensuring we're keeping people securely housed? Now, I know there's some comments in the chat about trying to figure out how to raise our own revenue, right? How to set up something like a housing trust fund. And could that support units? Could that also support needed services? So that's one idea that's been put forth.
I'm trying to respond in data and all of that. So I think that you've got all of the diversity that you need in it. I'm always coming from the heart first. At this point, I just feel I strongly believe that we've allowed folks to operate from just a place of greed. What's in it for me? What can I get? What's the and we see the fruit of it. And so I don't know, we've got to go back and fix some things. I feel like that for me, what, as opposed to me asking what they can do, they should be asking us what they can do. That they should be telling us and offering to bring solutions to us. I want to shift the narrative on this. If the community knew what to do, they wouldn't be homeless. If we knew what to ask you all for, we wouldn't be in these situations. We wouldn't be, we don't even know at this point, you all, how to advocate for ourselves anymore. We don't know what resources that are out there for us, what it is that you have. There are some things and policies that are in place that have got to change on a federal level, on a state level, and on a local level. But before we can even really have a conversation about what we're imagining the world, but I feel like there are people that are here in these seats, in these places, that need to come to the table and say, hey, this is what it is that we can do. Let's have those kind of conversations. What can you do? What can you change?
Yeah.
I agree with Tony. We need to have these conversations with our local politicians. I mean, we need to start on a city level, on a county level. I mean, the federal government, state of California, I mean, things will come down the line at some point. But right now, we should be having these conversations about our communities. What is happening in our communities? What can they do to help us help these families in our communities? What is it that we see that, you know, they need to take a look at? You know, I mean, it's again, there's just a lot of greed when it comes to rental housing, and you know, you can only do so much. So again, we need to have these conversations with our local politicians and hopefully start on a local level and then work our way up.
Yeah, I appreciate that reframing that you both provided. And I think we are at a point, right, where, and I appreciate that San Joaquin COG has sort of supported looking into this and creating, you know, this report and this tool that allows not only them, but all of us to have a better understanding of what is happening in our community, right? And how can they, as an actor and as an administrator of funds, again, be thinking proactively about not perpetuating harm with kind of how we're using our investments. And so today was really about kind of setting the stage, and I just deepest gratitude to Tony and Robert for participating in this conversation. I know you're out there. I know you're saying this every day. So appreciate that you took the time. Sorry if you can hear that very loud phone next to me. And so tomorrow we're going to kind of start talking about solutions, right? To talk about the practical tools that can be extracted out of all of this data that we presented today and what our public agencies can do moving forward. And with that, I want to turn this back over to Kim, who opened up our call, and hopefully we can all hear her now and kind of end with some words from San Joaquin Council of Government. So Kim, if you're there, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you, Christine. Sorry for that earlier. It was a audio issue where board member Wright and I couldn't hear each other, but you could hear both of us. So sincere apologies for that. And thank you for the notes in the chat. And yes, as Christine said, thank you all for being here. This was a great turnout today. And yes, this is just a first step for SJCOG. Christine Corrales and her team with Enterprise Community Partners and our friends at UC Davis have done an excellent job in getting these deliverables. We'll be finalizing those, so they will be available relatively soon. And please, if you can, come join us tomorrow and continue this conversation. And although he can't hear me, special thank you to Board Member Wright for being here today.
Great. Thank you, everyone. I'll be
I can hear you.
around. You can't hear me? Oh, okay, well, if you can't hear me, I'm sticking around until 1. So if you have thoughts or questions you want to put in the chat, this Mentimeter is still live. Happy to keep capturing feedback. Otherwise, we'll hope to see you tomorrow as we kind of talk about next steps. So thank you all for attending today.